He stood quietly at the back of the ceremony, watching the boy he adopted and raised walk toward the altar. To him, that was his son. But not everyone saw it that way. The bride's mother leaned in with a cold smile and quietly told him he didn't belong. Guests started to whisper. Eyes turned. Tension filled the room. And just when it seemed like he might walk away, the groom picked up the mic. What he said next left the entire wedding in silence. The sun was warm, the chairs were perfectly aligned, and soft string music played as guests whispered and smiled. It should have been the happiest day of his son's life, and for James, it almost was. He sat in the second row, just behind the bride's family, dressed in a clean navy suit with a pale pink boutonniere. He didn't need attention. He didn't want it. He only came to see his boy, the boy he'd raised since he was 4, become a husband. James had never missed a milestone. Not the scraped knees, not the science fairs, not the heartbreaks. He was the one who taught him to tie a tie. The one who showed up to every parent-teacher night when nobody else would. That boy, now a man, had never once called him anything but Dad. But across the aisle, the bride's mother noticed him. Her name was Margaret. Polished, proud, traditional. She leaned toward her daughter, whispering something with tight lips and cold eyes. Then she stood, walked straight over to James, and with a sharp, deliberate point of her finger, she said quietly, "You shouldn't be here. This is family." James didn't move. His eyes searched hers, calm but hurt. Around them, guests had started to look over. Some stared in silence, others looked away. No one said a word. And that's when James heard a voice, not Margaret's. A voice from the altar. The groom had seen everything, and he was already reaching for the mic. The mic let out a soft hum as the groom took it in his hand, his fingers trembling just enough to notice. His eyes locked on James, not Margaret, not the guests, just James. "Before we go any further," he said, his voice steady but tight, "there's something I need to say." The officiant looked confused. The bride's father shifted in his seat. Margaret froze, still standing over James like she hadn't just tried to erase the man who raised him. "I was 4 when I met him," the groom said, "and I remember everything. I remember crying in the dark and his hand holding mine. I remember the day he taught me how to ride a bike even though I was scared out of my mind. I remember the first time he showed up at school wearing that old work uniform, embarrassed, because he was the only dad who came straight from the night shift. But he came." The groom's voice cracked, just once. "This man," he said, pointing directly at James, "is my father, not by blood, but by everything that matters. He's the reason I became the man standing here today." There were gasps. A few people looked away, uncomfortable. But the bride, she looked mortified. Her eyes darted from her mother to her soon-to-be husband, and for the first time, she seemed unsure. Margaret stepped back, but her expression didn't soften. She muttered something under her breath and returned to her seat, arms crossed like she'd just been betrayed. The groom hadn't finished. He looked down for a moment, then raised his eyes to the crowd. "I didn't plan to say any of this, but maybe it needed to be said." He looked back at James, whose eyes were glistening now. "I love you, Dad." The ceremony still hadn't started. But the room, the mood, had completely changed. And then, without warning, the bride walked off the stage. She didn't run. She didn't cry. She walked slow, deliberate steps past the altar, past the stunned guests, straight toward the little tent set up behind the floral arch. People turned in their seats, murmurs rising like a wave. The groom hesitated, mic still in hand, watching her disappear behind the white curtain. No one knew what to do. The officiant glanced around, frozen between professionalism and panic. Margaret's arms were still folded, her face tight with quiet rage. James stood now, not to follow her, not to make a scene, but to leave. He couldn't bear the feeling in the air, the stares, the weight, the subtle judgment. He took a step back, then another, nodding politely to the few people who had the decency to look ashamed. But just as he reached the end of the aisle, a hand grabbed his. It was the groom. "Don't," he said quietly. "You walk out now, she wins, and I lose more than I can afford to." James looked at his son, truly looked. And beneath the tailored suit and boutonniere was the same scared little boy who once begged not to be left alone in a foster home. "She's your bride," James said softly. "You should go to her." The groom nodded. "I will, but not without knowing you're staying." And with that, he let go and walked toward the tent where the bride had vanished. Each step felt heavier than the last. Guests whispered behind cupped hands. Margaret turned to her husband, whispering sharply. But he didn't respond. His eyes were locked on his daughter's exit, confusion wrinkling his brow. Inside the tent, the groom found her standing with her back to him, arms wrapped around herself. She didn't turn when he entered. He said her name once, softly. And when she finally turned to face him, there were no tears, only a question. "Did you have to do that? In front of everyone?" He took a breath, steadying the swirl of emotions building in his chest. "I didn't plan it," he said, "but I wasn't going to stand there and let someone erase the man who gave me everything." She looked at him, eyes sharp now, like she was searching for something behind his words. "It's not that I don't respect what he's done," she replied, arms still folded tightly. "But this was supposed to be our day, not that." "That?" he repeated, his voice rising just enough to sting. "You mean the part where your mother tried to kick out the only father I've ever had? Or the part where I finally stood up for him?" Silence filled the tent. Outside, the guests still waited, unsure if the wedding was still happening. James remained by the edge of the aisle, not sitting, not standing fully, just caught in the middle, unsure whether to disappear or stay visible. The bride's expression softened just slightly. "You embarrassed her?" she said. The groom blinked. Embarrassed her? She humiliated him. She didn't even have the decency to whisper. She pointed at him like he was trash. "On our wedding day." She lowered her head. "I didn't know she'd do that." "Didn't you?" he asked. "You've heard her talk about him before. You've seen the way she looks at him." There was no answer. Finally, she whispered, "She's still my mother." He nodded slowly. "And he's my father. So I guess the question is, which one of us gets to have our family here today?" Her eyes flickered, and something shifted behind them. Guilt, maybe, or fear. But before she could answer, a voice came from outside the tent. It was the officiant, clearing his throat nervously. Are we still proceeding?" The groom turned back to her. "Are we?" She looked at the ground, her bare heels pressing into the grass beneath the white linen of her dress. For a moment, it felt like the world paused. The voices outside faded. The air inside the tent was thick with everything they hadn't said before now. Then she spoke, quiet but clear. "I love you. I chose you. But this isn't how I pictured today going." He stepped closer. "Neither did I. But sometimes what we picture doesn't matter. What we stand for does." Her eyes finally met his again, and something in them shifted, not all at once, but like a door cracking open. "If we go back out there, she'll be furious." "She already is," he replied. "But I don't care, because I won't spend the rest of my life apologizing for the man who raised me. If she can't accept that, then maybe she shouldn't be sitting in the front row." That hit her. She inhaled sharply, and for a moment he thought she might walk away for good. But instead, she reached for his hand. "Then let's go," she said. "Let's finish this together." They stepped out of the tent, hand in hand. The guests straightened in their seats, eyes following their every move. Some looked relieved. Others whispered with a mix of intrigue and judgment. Margaret's jaw clenched when she saw them, her daughter holding the hand of a man who had just chosen his father over her comfort. The officiant welcomed them back with nervous politeness, clearly unsure what to say, but the groom didn't take his place at the altar just yet. He walked back toward the second row, toward James. And without asking, without hesitation, he extended his hand. "Come stand with me," he said. James blinked. "Are you sure?" The groom nodded. "I wouldn't be here without you. I'm not taking that walk without you." James stood. The crowd went quiet again. And together, they stepped toward the altar. But just as they reached the front, Margaret stood up. Again. Margaret rose like a storm cloud about to break. Her heels clicked sharply against the wood as she stepped forward. Her lips pursed, her voice just loud enough for everyone to hear. "This is not how weddings are done," she snapped. "This is chaos. It's disrespectful to tradition, to family, to everything we planned." Gasps rippled through the audience. The groom tightened his grip on James's hand but didn't look away. "You're right," he said. "It's not how you pictured it. But this isn't your wedding." Margaret ignored him. Her eyes burned into her daughter. "And you're going to let this continue? You're going to let him hijack this day with some speech and drag him up there like a spectacle?" The bride inhaled sharply, but to everyone's surprise, she didn't retreat. She stepped forward, her voice steady. "He's not a spectacle. He's my husband's father. And if you can't accept that, you can leave." That silenced the crowd. For the first time, Margaret's confidence faltered. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Her husband, still seated beside her, placed a gentle hand on her wrist, not to control her, but to stop her. He shook his head slowly, the weariness in his eyes impossible to ignore. Margaret looked around, suddenly aware of just how many people were watching, judging, not applauding her for standing her ground, but waiting to see how far she'd go. She sat down. Not because she agreed, but because she'd lost control. The groom exhaled and looked at his bride. "You ready?" he whispered. She nodded. "Let's do this." The officiant began to speak, voice calm but still shaken by the tension that had just unfolded, and for a while it seemed like the worst was behind them. But as the vows began, James noticed something strange. Margaret wasn't just sitting quietly. She was texting. James tried to ignore it. He didn't want to cause another stir, especially not during the vows. But he couldn't unsee it. Margaret, hunched slightly in her seat, phone glowing in her lap, fingers moving with purpose. Not scrolling, typing, sending. The bride spoke her vows with shaky grace, her voice soft, pausing only once when she glanced at her mother who didn't even look up. The groom smiled gently at her, squeezing her hands as he began his own. But James's attention was pulled elsewhere. Margaret's screen lit up again, just enough for him to catch two words before it dimmed. "Call security." His stomach dropped. For a moment he questioned what he'd seen. Maybe it wasn't what it looked like. Maybe she was just angry texting a friend. But something in her posture felt deliberate, calculating. He leaned slightly toward the groom and whispered without turning his head, "She's calling someone." The groom didn't respond right away. He was still mid-vow, pausing only slightly before continuing with, "I promise to stand by you even when others don't understand us, even when it's hard." He locked eyes with James for just a second. "Because I know what it means to be chosen, to be fought for." As the officiant began to close the ceremony, James felt it again, that quiet unease. And then, near the back of the venue, movement. A tall man in a black polo stepped just inside the tent, speaking into a headset. Another followed, then another. The groom turned his head. His face changed. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered. Guests started noticing too. Heads turned. Voices rose. Margaret stood up again, this time slowly, with an air of confidence. "This is a private event," she said loud enough to be heard. "And I have the right to remove uninvited guests." Her eyes locked onto James. The groom dropped his bride's hand and stepped between them. "You brought security? For him?" Margaret didn't blink. "He doesn't belong here. He's not on the official list." The tension snapped like a rubber band stretched too far. And then, from the back, a woman's voice rang out. "Actually, he is." The entire tent turned toward the voice. A woman in her 60s stood just inside the entrance, clutching a small clutch bag and wearing a navy blue dress that shimmered slightly in the light. She stepped forward with calm authority, heels silent against the aisle runner. Her face was familiar, a family resemblance to the groom, and when she looked at James, her eyes softened with warmth. "I'm the wedding coordinator," she said clearly. "And I made the final guest list. James is absolutely invited. In fact," she turned her eyes to the security team, "he's family. Anyone who tries to remove him will be asked to leave themselves." The guards looked at one another, awkward now, caught between duty and decency. One of them nodded slightly, muttered something into his radio, and backed off. The other two followed. Margaret was left standing alone in the middle of the aisle, her mouth slightly open, blinking as if she couldn't comprehend what had just happened. You don't have the right," she began. But the groom interrupted. "Yes, she does. She helped plan this wedding when you stopped answering calls. She handled the vendors. She even picked the music." He turned to James again. "Because she knew what mattered." The bride stepped forward, gently touching her mother's arm. "Mom, please stop. This is our wedding. You don't have to like everything, but if you can't at least respect the people I love, then maybe you shouldn't be here." Margaret's lip quivered. Her pride had no more moves left. For a few seconds, she just stood there, a woman who'd lost her grip on the narrative, now exposed in front of everyone. Then, without a word, she turned and walked back to her seat. Not defeated, but deflated. James, still standing at the front, let out the breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The bride gave him a small nod, not an apology, but a quiet acknowledgement. The officiant, now visibly rattled, looked between the couple and the crowd. "Shall we continue?" The groom smiled. "Yes, let's finally make this official." But just as the ceremony resumed, James felt a tap on his shoulder and turned to see a face from his past he never expected. James turned slowly, expecting maybe another guest, a vendor, someone checking in. But the face he saw stopped him cold. It was Daryl. Same sharp jaw, same cautious eyes, older now, grayer at the temples, but unmistakable. Daryl had been James's caseworker back when he first took in the boy. The man who said it would be temporary. The one who warned him, raising a white child as a single black man, it won't be easy. "Didn't think you'd remember me," Daryl said, offering a small, crooked smile. James was stunned. "I never forgot. I saw the invite float through social," Daryl explained. "Didn't know if I'd actually come, but I had to see it." He glanced toward the groom and bride, who were exchanging quiet smiles now as the officiant resumed the ceremony. "You did it, James. You raised him into a man. And not just any man, one brave enough to call the truth out loud." James's throat tightened. He didn't respond, just nodded, emotions too full to speak. Daryl glanced toward Margaret. "I've seen that kind of hatred before. Back in courtrooms, back in custody hearings. But I've never seen it lose in front of this many people." He placed a hand on James's shoulder. "You turned a foster file into a fatherhood story. You earned this moment." The officiant spoke again. "By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife." The crowd erupted in cautious applause, a mix of relief and genuine joy. The kiss was brief, tender, but it felt like a declaration. A final push back against everything that tried to ruin the moment. James wiped his eye and looked over at the man he'd raised. For a second, they locked eyes. And the groom mouthed, without sound, "Thank you." But behind the applause and the music, James saw Margaret slip away, purse in hand, walking down the side of the tent. Not a word, not a glance. Just gone. The reception moved forward like nothing had happened. Champagne flowed, laughter returned, and music filled the air as plates clinked and guests took their seats. But beneath the celebration, a quiet reverence hung in the space around James. People who hadn't spoken to him earlier now came over, some offering firm handshakes, others soft smiles, and even a few apologies. One older woman simply placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "You're what a real father looks like." James didn't need the praise. He hadn't done it for recognition. But for the first time that day, he felt something settle in his chest. Not pride, not vindication, but peace. The groom eventually made his way to him, now untied from formality, holding 2 glasses of champagne. He handed one to James, grinning. "You were supposed to sit quietly and blend in?" he teased. James chuckled. "I tried." "No, you didn't," the groom said, raising his glass. "And thank God for that." They clinked glasses. Then the bride appeared, her smile hesitant but genuine. She looked, James in the eyes, really looked this time. "I owe you an apology," she said softly. "For not stopping her, for not speaking sooner." James nodded. "You spoke when it mattered." "I was scared," she admitted. "Scared of disappointing her, of conflict. But I saw what love looks like today, and it wasn't fear." James smiled gently. "Love's not always clean, but when it's real, it shows up. Even when it's inconvenient." She leaned in and hugged him. Not a quick, polite gesture, but something that lingered, that meant something. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the lights above the dance floor flickered on, James stepped back to watch it all. His son, his daughter-in-law, a future built not on approval, but truth. He didn't need a front row anymore. He'd already stood exactly where he needed to be. Sometimes family isn't written in blood, it's written in moments, in sacrifice, in the courage to show up even when you're told not to. If this story moved you, hold on to the people who choose you, and never be afraid to stand for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable.